we don't want to talk about Mitch Marner. Like, we really don't. It's not something that we want to do, but we feel compelled to do it because it feels like his camp will never let us forget that he does not have a contract. I guess let's put it this way. Do you think that this is mostly Mitch Marner's camp? Is this a strategy that they have in terms of trying to leak certain things, or is this both sides kind of playing a little bit dirty when it comes to the information that we have about these negotiations?
Well, I think in this particular case, if you look at the history of, and the agent who represents Mitch is Darren Ferris, who's a Toronto-based guy. If you look at the history of some of his contract battles with some of the previous teams, he's had like several of his clients have either gone over to train or talked about going overseas. One was Josh Anderson in Columbus, one was Athanasiou in Detroit, one was Sam Bennett in Calgary. So when this came out the other day, I don't think anybody saw it as a huge surprise. So put it that way. I think like the problem right now, JD, is that there's no deadline right now. I think that any kind of, and plus, with Marner and Laine, they're such big names and on big-time Canadian teams. Like the slightest morsel that gets out, it's a gong show because people are just craving any kind of news. So, I mean, I just think that it's because it's the summer, the slightest morsel of news that gets out there turns into craziness. I think the thing about the Marner thing that's really fascinating to me is, I've had people tell me that they don't think they're really that far off on a short-term deal, and I've had other people telling me that the team is really starting to get fed up with the way this is going. So, I mean, we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I find that fascinating. Like, I was talking to Craig Custance last week, and he mentioned that it's actually a little bit more positive on the Toronto end because at least they're talking. Some of the other camps, we don't know what the discussions are. And I think that was brought up when CJ did interview Laine, right, is that he still hadn't really heard from the team. He wasn't really aware of what was going on with him. At least with Marner, there's some progress. And so I think we understand that, we're complicit in some of this sports talk radio shows that have things that or don't have a lot of hockey things to talk about. So we obsess over those morsels. Like, I definitely think that's a part of it. But when you mention that the team might be getting frustrated, like, is there something different in terms of the way that Marner's camp is handling things than I would say other negotiations in the past, or something that makes this stand out?
It's a good question, JD. I think that, I think to me, if my read on it is, I think if there's a frustration, it's that, it's been going on for 14 months, and are we really that close? Like, again, I've had people tell me they think on a 3-year deal, they don't think the two sides are that far apart. Mm-hmm. But I'm not sure that that's really what the Leafs would want, to do this again in 3 years. I think on a long-term deal, they're really not that close. I mean, this, of course, could blow up in my face tomorrow, but I don't think they are. I think that, so to me, what I think the frustration is that if you want to do a long-term deal, I think they just haven't moved anywhere. And I think that the organization is really frustrated by that it's not going anywhere. And, I think, the other thing too is that I just think that there is a real feeling by the Leafs that what happened with Nylander, they're not doing that again. Yeah. Like, they're not going through that again. They're not signing a guy on December 1st. And, I just think that there's a lot of frustration because of all of that. I'm sure Marner's got to be frustrated too. Like, I mean, this can't be, like, the other teams that have dealt with him this summer, they don't think that he wants to leave Toronto. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's got to be frustrating him too. I'm sure he's looking at all this like, I wish this was over.
Yeah, I mean, his Instagram would beg to differ. He seems pretty comfortable, seems pretty relaxed this summer. But yeah, I'll bet there's definitely some frustration boiling underneath the surface. Okay, he's not alone here, right? Like, there's an incredible crop of RFAs here, and Aho gets done because of the offer sheet, but everybody else is still out here. Are you convinced that he has to be the first guy to sign?
Well, we saw a guy sign today.
Yeah.
And I know he's not
Different
one of the
class.
biggest guys, but Colin White did sign, and I certainly think that that was positive news. I do think a lot of people are waiting, for Marner. I do think that because, and we'll see. The other thing you don't know is, remember a couple of years ago, Pasternak, he waited until the last minute, and then he signed. He admitted later that he wasn't going to miss any time. And if you've heard him ever talk about it since then, he talks about how lucky he is to make the money he does, and he's good with that. And I think the thing about that is how many guys are like that. The problem with talking about this right now is what are you missing if you don't sign now? You're not missing anything. Now, let's see what happens when we go into camp. Let's see what happens when we get closer to the first games. But how many Pasternaks are there? Guys who are sitting there saying, privately, I'm not going to tell you this. I'm not going to miss any time, but I want to see if waiting a bit longer gets me a little bit more. I suspect there's some guys like that. I don't know who, but I suspect there's some guys like that. And then, but if you take a look at this, the McDavid deal, and nobody's going to argue that Connor McDavid isn't worth every penny that he's making. If anything, the guy's probably underpaid. That moved the line, right? All of a sudden, Draisaitl goes from 6.5 to 8.5. The Jack Eichel deal, that moved the line. Jack Eichel's 10.5. All these guys are like, well, if he's 10.5, I should be in that range too. The Matthews deal last year, that moved the line. So I think everybody's kind of waiting there to see what's the deal that moves the line this time, because that'll benefit all the rest of us. So who's the big guy that's going to go first? So I'll tell you this. I do think this. If you were to pick a guy that aside from White today, pick a guy that a lot of people think will go first, it's Point. But that might be a bridge deal. So how much is that going to change anything?
That's what I find especially interesting about these negotiations. And like you say, Point could be a bridge deal, and that maybe they're close on a shorter contract with Mitch Marner, is guys maybe potentially being more willing to take those kind of deals. But if the line is moving, as you say, and we are noticing that there's less of a bargain on buying out UFA years because the RFA guys are getting paid so much money,
yep.
Do you get a sense that maybe this is just going to become more commonplace? There's less incentive to give guys long-term deals because you're not getting the price break that you used to get with that term.
The only thing I would argue with you there, JD, is that with the best players, it never gets cheaper long-term. Mm-hmm. Never. I would always, if I was a GM, I would always want term. Mm-hmm. And the other thing too is, and we're kind of the league and the players are working on an extension now, and I think there's a lot of optimism that they're going to get it done. But one of the things, and we talked about this, I think back in June when the Board of Governors met in Las Vegas, all of the projections that the league and the players are talking about, and the league presented to them, have big jumps in 2 years. With the new U.S. TV deal coming that the league is confident it's going to get. And I've heard a lot of rumblings that there's good reason for that confidence. So if you're Point or you're Marner or whoever you are and you lock in for 3 years, who's to say those numbers in 3 years won't be even bigger?
Yeah, that's a good point.
So I'll tell you this. If I have a great player, and I think Marner's a great player, and I think Point's a great player, these guys we're talking about here, I'm always going for term if I'm the team. Always, always, always.
Talking to Elliotte Friedman. So are we sure that the Maple Leafs are done and they're just waiting? This is the final piece of the puzzle, getting Marner under contract? Or is there the potential for more moves once they have the certainty of that deal being done?
Well, I haven't heard of anything else, Ben. I'm sure they're always looking at things. I haven't heard of anything else. I don't know how they would necessarily be able to do anything else. They've got the whole interest, the strategy that they've got, and with the long-term injuries, it's very fascinating. And the other thing too is if he signs after the start of the season, we saw this with Nylander, the cap hit goes up for this year. And that's got a few teams kind of worried. I know of at least one team out there, and they didn't really confirm it, but they didn't really deny it either, that passed up another move because they have an RFA, and they passed up another move where they have an RFA because they're like, if our guy signs after the start of the season, that cap hit's going to go up this season, and we don't know what exactly the amount of room we have is. So I think that's the other thing Toronto has to deal with, is if they think that, let's just say, for example, he signs for 3 times 8. If he signs after the season starts, that 8 is more this year. So you have to deal with that too.
So I saw a report from Lance Hornby. I shouldn't say a report, but it was a clip where he said, waiting to see what unfolds is UFA defenseman Gardiner yet to sign elsewhere and hopes the Leafs find extra cash. But at this stage, that could mean trading a set roster piece. Do you think there is still likelihood Jake Gardiner could return here, or that, I don't want to judge him, but do you think it might be a little foolish if he's waiting on the Leafs, considering their cap crunch?
I don't think he's waiting on the Leafs. I think the other thing, too, is if you take a look at, where it stands right now with them, at best, like if he's going to take, for example, like a short-term deal for another contract, at best now he's a third-pairing defenseman in Toronto, and with both Riley and Barry here, he's going to be the third D at best on the power play. Like, to me, now if he says, I just love it here and I want to play here, that's one thing. But if he's looking to, supercharge his market value, I don't know if playing here does that. I think there's, I've heard the rumors that he's waiting for a team to make a move. I do think there's some interest in him. I think Arizona's had interest in him, and I do wonder about Buffalo. Like, if they do make the Ristolainen move, I wonder if that's a possibility. I just don't know if it's going to be as big as he hoped for it to be. Again, unless he really says, I love Toronto, I want to come back and play here. If he's trying to jumpstart his value, I don't see the spot for him where that's going to happen in this lineup.